Most people believe that to survive the Titanic, you had to be lucky. But what if you were so lucky that death eventually gave up on trying to take you? Meet Violet Jessop. History knows her as Miss Unsinkable, but that title is a lie. She wasn't just unsinkable. She was an anomaly in the fabric of reality. By the time she stood on the tilting deck of the world's most famous ship, she had already looked death in the eye and laughed twice.
I have always felt that if one is to live, one will live. The sea is a great master, but it is not the only one I have had to serve.
This isn't just a story about a shipwreck. This is the human arc of a woman who spent 42 years at sea, survived the 3 greatest maritime disasters of the 20th century, and proved that sometimes the universe simply cannot kill you. The battle didn't start on the Atlantic. It started in the dust of Argentina in 1887. Violet was the first of 9 children born to Irish immigrants. Life was already a struggle for survival in a world where medicine was still in its infancy. When Violet was just a child, she contracted tuberculosis. In the late 19th century, that was a death sentence. The doctors didn't give her a fighting chance. They gave her 3 months to live. They told her mother to prepare a small grave.
I remember the doctors standing over me like judges passing a sentence. They spoke of me as if I were already gone, but I felt a strange heat in my chest, a stubbornness that refused to let go of the air.
Violet didn't die in 3 months. She didn't die in a year. Against every scientific prediction of the era, she recovered. Her lungs, which were supposed to fail, grew strong enough to hold the breath she would one day need while submerged in the freezing depths of the ocean. After her father passed away, the family moved back to Great Britain. Violet's mother became a stewardess to keep the family afloat, but when her mother fell ill, 18-year-old Violet had to step into the role.
I went to the interview with a heavy heart. I didn't want the sea, but the sea seemed to want me. I dressed to look older, more capable than I felt, and I waited for the world to open up.
In 1910, she joined the titan of the industry, the White Star Line. She was assigned to the RMS Olympic. At the time, it was the largest civilian liner in existence. Violet thought she was entering a life of luxury and travel. She had no idea she was actually stepping onto the first of 3 doomed vessels. The ocean was waiting for her, and on September 20th, 1911, the first crack in the Unsinkable dream was about to appear. 1911 was supposed to be the year the White Star Line conquered the world. They didn't just build ships. They built titans, designed to make the Atlantic Ocean feel like a minor inconvenience. Violet Jessop was 23 years old, standing on the decks of the RMS Olympic, the largest, most luxurious moving object ever created by human hands. For a girl who had spent her childhood fighting for air in the dust of the Argentinian pampas, the Olympic felt like a fortress. It was a world of mahogany, crystal, and the steady, reassuring hum of massive engines that promised a security no storm could break.
The Olympic was more than a ship. It was a statement. We walked those halls with a sense of pride that bordered on arrogance. We believed the engineers. We believed the steel. It felt solid, like the very ground beneath our feet. I thought I had finally found a place where the world couldn't reach me.
But the universe has a way of reminding us that nothing is truly untouchable. On September 20th, 1911, while steaming through the Solent, the unsinkable dream met the reality of physics. The HMS Hawk, a British warship with a reinforced iron prow designed for one thing, ramming, was drawn in by the massive suction of the Olympic's hull. The collision was violent and instantaneous. The Hawk's prow tore into the Olympic's side, flooding two of her massive compartments. Violet was in her cabin when the impact jolted the world off its axis.
The sound. It wasn't just a crash. It was a grinding, screaming moan of steel against steel that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. For a moment, the world simply stopped. Silence followed the thunder. We were told the ship was unsinkable, but as I looked at the faces of the passengers in the hallway, I saw the first flickers of a terror that would soon become very familiar.
The Olympic limped back to port, battered but afloat. To the public, it was proof the design worked. To Violet, it was a warning. She didn't want to go back to sea. She felt a cold shiver every time she looked at the dark horizon. But her friends and the pressure of the White Star Line won out. They told her it would be a splendid experience. And so, 7 months later, on the morning of April 10th, 1912, Violet stepped across the gangplank at Southampton and onto the deck of the RMS Titanic. She carried her small suitcase, her sense of duty, and a folded piece of parchment given to her by an old woman, a Hebrew prayer for protection.
I remember the smell of newness. New paint, new silk, new hope. The Titanic was even more grand than her sister, a city afloat that seemed to challenge the very sky. I tucked that prayer into my apron pocket, a tiny shield against the vastness of the Atlantic. I didn't know then that in just 4 days I would be reciting those words as the world fell apart beneath my feet.
The first 4 days of the Titanic's maiden voyage were a dream of Edwardian perfection. For Violet, it was a blur of starching linens, serving tea to the world's wealthiest elite, and marveled at the sheer stability of the ship. The Atlantic was like a mirror, flat, dark, and deceptively welcoming. But beneath that surface, the arc of history was tightening. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the air turned needle cold. Violet had finished her shift and was sitting in her bunk, reading a magazine and listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the ship's orchestra. She felt safe. She felt protected by the prayer in her pocket. Until the world shuddered.
It wasn't a crash like the Olympic. It was a long, low, grinding sound, like the ship was being dragged over a bed of giant marbles. I sat up in my bunk, waiting for the engines to restart. But the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. It was the sound of a giant heart stopping in the middle of a dark, frozen void.
Violet was ordered onto the deck. She didn't panic. She was a professional, a veteran of the Olympic collision. She spent those first frantic hours helping women and children into lifeboats, reassuring them with a calm she didn't truly feel. As the deck began to tilt toward the black water, an officer approached her at Lifeboat 16. He didn't just ask her to board. He handed her a bundle. A baby whose mother was nowhere to be found.
The officer thrust the bundle into my arms and said, "Look after this, will you?" I looked down at the child, so small and oblivious to the tragedy unfolding around us. As our boat was lowered into the darkness, I clutched that baby to my chest, my apron pocket pressing the Hebrew prayer against the child's heart. I realized then that my survival wasn't just for me anymore.
From the safety of the lifeboat, Violet watched the impossible happen. The Titanic, the unsinkable city, was standing almost vertical against the stars. The lights flickered one last time and then went out, leaving only the screams of 1,500 souls and the terrifying sound of the great ship breaking in two. The ocean that had been a master was now a graveyard. Violet sat in the freezing dark for 8 hours, shielding the baby from the spray, watching the dawn break over a world that would never be the same. She had survived the greatest maritime disaster in history, but the arc of her destiny was only halfway finished. When the RMS Carpathia finally pulled into New York Harbor, the world didn't give the survivors a moment of silence. They gave them a spectacle. Before the gangplank even touched the dock, the air was thick with the blinding flash of magnesium bulbs and the desperate shouts of 1,000 reporters. Violet Jessop stepped off that ship as a living ghost. She was swarmed by men in trench coats clutching notebooks, offering money for a quote, a tear, or a description of the final plunge. To the world, she was a headline. To herself, she was just a woman who couldn't stop hearing the screams.
The cameras, they felt like weapons. Every flash was a reminder of the lightning over the North Atlantic. They wanted me to be a hero or a miracle, but I just wanted to be invisible. I realized then that the only place I felt truly understood was back on the water, where the horizon didn't ask questions. I was back on the Olympic within 2 months. I had to go back, or I would have lost my nerve forever.
But the peace she sought wouldn't last. By 1914, the golden age of the Edwardian era was a memory, buried under the soot of a world at war. The lights of Europe were going out, and the great liners were being stripped of their silk and mahogany to become machines of conflict. Violet could have stayed on shore, but the arc of her life wasn't a circle. It was a straight line toward duty. She joined the British Red Cross, trading her stewardess apron for the veil of a nurse. In 1916, she was assigned to the third and final sister, the HMHS Britannic. By 1914, the golden age of the Edwardian era was a memory, buried under the soot of a world at war. The lights of Europe were going out, and the great liners, once symbols of luxury, were being stripped of their silk and mahogany to become machines of conflict.
The Britannic didn't look like her sisters anymore. She was painted white with a giant green stripe and massive red crosses that glowed under the Mediterranean sun. We weren't serving caviar to millionaires. We were tending to the broken, the burned, and the dying. It was a floating sanctuary, or so we chose to believe. But as we steamed into the Aegean Sea, I felt that same cold shiver I had felt in 1912. The ocean wasn't finished with me.
On the morning of November 21st, near the Greek island of Kea, the Britannic hit a German sea mine. The explosion was massive. Because of the heat in the Aegean, many of the ship's lower portholes had been left open for ventilation. A fatal mistake. The Britannic didn't linger like the Titanic. She was sinking 4 times faster. Panic, which had been a slow burn in 1912, was now a flash fire. As the ship tilted, the captain kept the engines running, trying to beach the massive vessel on the nearby shore. It was a desperate move that created a nightmare. The massive propellers at the stern were still spinning, rising out of the water like giant revolving guillotines.
The lifeboats were being lowered while the ship was still moving. We were being sucked toward the stern, toward those massive, churning blades of steel. I looked back and saw the boat behind me being ground to splinters. I knew I only had one choice. I had to jump.
Violet leaped into the churning water. As she surfaced, the suction of the giant propellers pulled her under. She was dragged toward the blades, her head striking the ship's keel with a sickening thud. Most humans would have died instantly, but the Ark held. She was rescued from the water, her skull fractured, but she was alive. Years later, when she went to a doctor for chronic headaches, they discovered she had survived a literal hole in her head. She had looked into the very gears of death and walked away a third time. The Britannic disappeared beneath the waves in just 55 minutes. The era of the Great Sisters was over. But Violet Jessop was just getting started. After the Britannic disappeared into the Aegean, most people expected Violet Jessop to never look at the ocean again. They expected her to find a quiet life on solid ground, far from the reach of the tide. But they didn't understand the Ark. Violet didn't quit. She didn't hide. She went back to the White Star Line, and later Red Star and Royal Mail, serving for another 34 years. She crossed the Atlantic over 200 times. She saw the rise of the jet engine and the slow decline of the great ocean liners. By the time she finally retired in 1950, she had spent 42 years of her life at sea. She had become the living memory of a vanished world.
People always asked me if I was afraid. They wanted to know how I could step onto a ship after seeing so much death. But the sea wasn't my enemy. It was my home. It had tested me, yes, but it had also spared me. When I finally stepped off a gangplank for the last time, I didn't feel like I was escaping. I felt like I was finally coming up for air.
Violet retired to a small 16th-century thatched cottage in Great Ashfield, England. She filled her garden with flowers and her house with the quiet peace she had earned. But the past has a way of calling when you least expect it. On a stormy night, years after her retirement, the telephone rang. Violet answered. On the other end was a voice she didn't recognize. The caller asked a single, chilling question. Are you the woman who saved a baby on the night the Titanic sank? When Violet replied that she was, the caller said, Well, I was that baby. Then they laughed and hung up.
I sat there in the silence of my cottage, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I never found out who it was. Some say it was a prank. Others say it was a ghost. But in that moment, I felt the arc click into place. That bundle I held in Lifeboat 16, that prayer in my pocket, it wasn't just about my survival. It was about a life that continued long after the ship was gone. The universe has a long memory.
Violet Jessop passed away in 1971 at the age of 83. She died of heart failure, her heart finally stopping on its own terms rather than those of the Atlantic. She remains a riddle to historians and a legend to the world. Was she the luckiest woman alive, or a harbinger of doom? Or was she something else entirely? A reminder that the human arc is not defined by the disasters we face, but by the quiet resolve to keep standing when the world falls apart beneath our feet. History calls her Miss Unsinkable, but those who know her story know the truth. She wasn't just a survivor. She was proof that some souls are simply too vast for the ocean to hold. History is more than a collection of dates and wreckage. It is a series of arcs, the invisible lines that connect our past to our present and our survival to our purpose. Violet Jessop was an anomaly, a woman who walked through the fire of 3 disasters and came out with her spirit intact. The ocean is deep, and its memory is long. But as long as we keep telling the stories, the lights of the great ships never truly go out. Until next time, stay above the waves. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Miss Unsinkable. If you found value in this human arc, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep digging into the dark corners of history to find the lights that refused to dim. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the past. Like the video if Violet's story moved you, and tell us in the comments, what is the most unsinkable part of your own story?